us to enjoy. But I would like to say thank you to those who will be the speakers tonight for our roundtable. Mr. Tom Tisdale, Selma Shine, Esther Ferguson, and Herbert Drayton III, who in many respects is standing in for his father for this conversation tonight. I'm going to give a short presentation, and I'm sure our speakers will add or perhaps even correct me from what I present here, and Deacon Greg will facilitate that conversation. But let's begin with a word of prayer, and we'll begin by praying a prayer from our prayer book for the human family that feels very appropriate for this piece of our history. So the Lord be with you. Let us pray. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay. So, in order to set the stage for our roundtable this evening, I think it's important to step back and say a few words about the change that happened in this neighborhood of Ansonboro leading up to this integrative period in our congregation's history. Can you go to the next slide? All right, so Ansonboro during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s was certainly a neighborhood that had a lot of African American families, many of whom were living in tenement homes. In 1941, the Charleston shipbuilders and dry dock company opened a facility to build warships. The docks employed African Americans who needed nearby housing. Ansonboro homeowners began subdividing their homes for rent and moving away. When the war ended, dock jobs began to disappear, and many of the renters found themselves out of work. By the 1950s, many of the residences in this neighborhood were in decline. By the late 1950s, the still relatively new historic Charleston Foundation, under the direction of Francis Edmonds, designated almost the entire neighborhood of Ansonboro as its target area for a new revolving fund and rehabilitation program. A pool of money would be used to acquire historic Ansonboro properties and complete partial renovation to allow for resale, with restrictive covenants attached to the deed. In other words, once renovated, only individuals with the financial resources to maintain the properties to historic Charleston standards were able to purchase the homes. Now, from a historic preservation standpoint, the project was a smashing success, but by Historic Charleston Foundation's own admission today, this project began a long period of gentrification that pushed out most of the African Americans living in the area around St. Stephen's. And by the 1970s and certainly the early 1980s, St. Stephen's was a dwindling African American congregation in a white neighborhood. Next slide. So the senior warden at the time of St. Stephen's integration was Charles Shine, and Charles put St. Stephen's situation in the mid-1980s this way. By 1985, 1986, St. Stephen's was about on the way out. We had very few members attending, and sometimes no priest. We'd have no more than 12 to 15 on a Sunday. If we had 20, we did really well. Those were some tough times, trying times. And then Charles went on to note that he began to get signals that the diocese was getting ready to close St. Stephen's. He said that he got a call from the diocese one day about doing an assessment on the church. And Charles said he sort of got the feeling about what that meant. But then Charles got a call to meet with a priest over at Saffron around the corner named Alan Houghton. I'll say more about Alan in a minute, and I have a feeling we're going to say a lot about Alan over the course of this time tonight. So Charles sat down with Alan, and Alan said to Charles, I think that we would like to see something different in Charleston. We would like to see an integrated church downtown, preferably an Episcopal Church. He said, what do you think about that? Charles said, well, I'm a senior board member. I've been a senior board member for quite a while, but don't let me make that decision by myself. Why don't we try to arrange a meeting with the vestry and some of the congregants and see whether or not they like your idea? And so Alan agreed to that. And a meeting was held here in the church with about 12 to 15 people. It involved not only members of the church at the time, but Alan, his wife Billy, and I believe Tom Tisdale was at that meeting. And then this is what Charles says about the meeting. We sat there and Alan said to them, we have an idea that can keep this church going. What if we integrate this church? And Charles said that the congregants sort of sat back and started whispering to one another and seeming a little unsure of what that would look like. You can go to the next slide. And then, and I have heard a lot of versions of this story. People definitely remember this as a pivotal moment in the lore of St. Stephen's. Mrs. Louise Washington, who was a real matriarch of St. Stephen's at the time, her extended family constituted a significant part of the congregation. Mrs. Louise Washington, she was at this meeting, and she got up and she said, I've heard different versions of what she said, but she said something to the effect of, I have no problem with white people. If they love Jesus, they are welcome. This is my church. Whatever it takes to keep my church going, I'm coming, and I want my church to keep going. And so out of respect for Mrs. Washington, a vote was never taken, and the church agreed to integrate with Alan as its new priest in charge. Next slide. There's the man. So in July of 1987, the Reverend Alanson B. Houghton Jr. Came to St. Stephen's as the new priest in charge. And my understanding is that first service in July of 87, there were not many white faces in the congregation at the time. I guess Tom maybe was there on that first Sunday, and then again Alan and Billy, and I think that was probably it on that first Sunday. Alan was sort of semi-retired at this point. He is an heir, or was an heir to the Corning Glass fortune in New York. His brother Amo, who I actually had an occasion to meet when I was right out of college, was a longtime congressman from New York. Alan had been the rector for a long time at the Church of the Heavenly Rest, which is a large church in New York City. But then he came down here because his father was getting medical treatment, and the doctor who treated his father, Dr. Lee, that doctor's son, Matt, is now active again in our congregation and attending our 9 o'clock service. And Matt was here as a teenager at the time. Alan, by all accounts, was a warm, outgoing, and gregarious soul. Anytime I've ever asked anybody about Alan Houghton, they just start smiling and laughing and giggling and have all sorts of stories to tell. Alan was very progressive, and he was very outspoken about his politics, from what I can tell. And he and his wife Billy made a wonderful team, and very quickly began to welcome some of their white friends into the congregation, and pretty quickly St. Stephen's began to integrate racially. Next slide. So when we integrated, a mission statement was put together at the time of integration to serve God as an Episcopal Church committed to congregational and community ministry, a fully integrated congregation which gathers in fellowship with one another to worship, learn, talk, and act, a community which is centered in Christ, cares about each other, and is concerned about the world at large, a mission-oriented congregation determined to carry the Word of God out into the community, a community of lay and clergy persons who give freely of their time and expertise, a congregation whose individual members make a serious commitment to pray, study, worship, serve, and give. Next slide. Okay, so I'd like to just touch briefly on some of the hallmarks of our mission during this integrative period. And the first hallmark clearly was welcome and hospitality. In talking to Charles and Thelma, I'm told that the African American members at the time of integration, they would stand outside the door and welcome in the white members who were coming. And so there was a wonderful spirit of welcome and inclusivity that I think Alan really led with as he carried forth his ministry as the priest in charge here. Next slide. Representation matters. As I've talked to people who lived through this period, they impressed upon me again and again how much Alan wanted to make sure that what people were seeing on the staff up around the altar mirrored the racially integrated congregation that he was wanting to create out in the pews. And here is just a sample of that. These are some early leaders of St. Stephen's at this time. You have Warren Bress, who's actually going to be a speaker for our LGBT roundtable. He was a leader of the congregation at this time, and also I think a signal that at this time St. Stephen's pretty quickly in this period also began to develop a reputation for an embrace of the LGBT community as an Episcopal church, perhaps the Episcopal church, that would welcome and embrace the LGBT community at the time. You have the inimitable Don White, who was the longtime organist here. I've heard a number of stories about Don White. I've been told that if somebody was speaking up down the pews, Don wouldn't hesitate to stand up, lean down, and tell people to shut up. I have another story to share about the clergy committee that I'll get to and their relationship with Don in just a minute. And then the woman here, her name is Kathy Hicks, and she worked in the office. And Kathy's two sons, Devon and Zach, still from time to time do come and worship with us here at St. Stephen's. Zach lives here locally, and Devon now has moved up to New England, but this is certainly still a home for them. But Tom has shared this with me. I mean, Tom Tisdale told me that Alan early on came to Tom and said, Tom, I need you to be the treasurer. And Tom said, Alan, I don't know anything about money. and Alan said, I don't care, you're white. So he was really concerned with making sure that there was racial diversity that people could see at all times. Next slide. And there's a picture of Esther, right, with Alan. And one of the clergy who came along while Alan was serving as priest here, that became a part of what has lovingly been called our clergy committee, Father John Richards, who was a Caribbean priest. You can look at the most recent memorial stone in the back is a tribute to those clergy that consisted of Alan, John Richards, Ben Smith, Frank McLean, and Maury Lent. Father Maury Lent is the only one in that group who is still living and still lives locally in Charleston. But I'm told that Alan was very excited when Father Richards came because, again, he wanted that kind of diversity of leadership. And many people don't realize this. Only the leaders or the preacher can know this. But there's actually a little plaque here at the lectern that is dedicated to Father Richards. I'm told he was a wonderful preacher. I'm told he would take his watch off before he would preach a sermon, and that he was a wonderful part of the clergy team during this time. A funny story about the clergy committee and Don White. I read something. I think it was something that Maury Lent wrote, or maybe something he said to me. He said that the clergy were sort of intimidated by Don. Don would play the communion anthem that he picked, even if communion was all done. And that would frustrate Alan. I'm told that there was times that Alan would stand here and communion would be over and Don would still be playing, and Alan would be trying to get Don's attention to stop with the music. And the clergy wanted to tell Don to cut his music short. But I think Ben Smith said, look, if one of us goes to Don, there's no way that we're going to win this argument. So let's all go and try to talk to Don about this. And so they sat Don down and they explained that he was playing the music too much, too long, and he had to cut it short. And Maury said that Don looked at them and said, do you know how much effort I put into choosing the music and choosing the anthems, and how much effort the choir goes to rehearsing all this, and you expect me after all that to cut that music short? And the entire clergy committee looked at Don and said together, yes. Next slide. And then the final hallmark that I would highlight about this period was a focus on mission and social justice. It's hard to see this article, but this is a newspaper article about the sacrificial way of giving at St. Stephen's. Now, St. Stephen's was fortunate at this time that Alan Houghton didn't need to take a salary, but St. Stephen's was able to give 50% of what they were taking in to the diocese and the wider community. That was a hallmark of what they tried to do at this time. And I am told, and maybe our panel can talk more about this, that Alan, when he was the priest here, used to have public forums on a number of controversial topics. And those forums would gather people from all over the community, and that was certainly, getting out, getting into the city. Alan was instrumental in starting what became 180 Place, and St. Stephen's parishioners during this era would team up and go and help out at the shelter. I mean, there was a real focus on carrying the work of the church out into the wider community. And so people started to notice what was happening at St. Stephen's. And if you think back, this is late 1980s Charleston, South Carolina. For a church to be going through this kind of intentional integration, it really caught people's attention. Next slide. And so there are any number of newspaper clippings that speak to what was happening. Here's one that says, formerly all black St. Stephen's proud of new mix. Next slide. Black Charleston Church integrates and starts growing. There's some from the Post and Courier, some from the Diocesan News, some from other local publications. Everybody was sort of covering St. Stephen's at the time and talking about what was happening in this place. Next slide. And then as we moved from the late 1980s into the 1990s, St. Stephen's began to go through not only a time of stabilization, but a real shift in moving from mission status, where the church was dependent on the diocese, to becoming a parish, where it could support itself on its own 2 feet. And Alan served from 1987 to 1993. Sort of on the back end of that time, the clergy committee took shape. The clergy committee were left in place after Alan left. Maury Lent tells me that Alan was very disappointed in him because Alan's dream was that Maury Lent, who was the youngest priest of that lot, would maybe become the priest of St. Stephen's, but Maury didn't want to do that. But when Alan left, that team stayed in place. And people tell me that they love that clergy committee because each of those clergy people brought something different. They all preached very differently. They all brought different gifts. And there was something really nice about that. But as we move, this is a picture of a famed vesture retreat that happened in the sort of early to mid 1990s, and apparently this is at Canoga in up near Nashville. Apparently there was a big snowstorm, and all of our vesture members got snowed in at Canoga, and it ended up being a really long stretch they had there. But Jenny Olbrecht ultimately came, and just as a little advertisement, Jenny Olbrecht will be our preacher at the 11 o'clock service next Sunday as a priest, sort of coming back and coming home to talk to us. Jenny was the interim rector who sort of picked up from the clergy committee as St. Stephen's was beginning to discern whether they could call a full-time rector, which they ultimately did in the person of Jim Bills. But I'll just say in sort of closing this that from what I've read and from what I've heard, I think that there were a lot of people that sort of liked the outside the box, sort of cutting edge feel that St. Stephen's took on in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when we were this integrated mission that seemed so different, and the clergy committee seemed so different than what you'd see in a normal church, that it does seem like there was some debate amongst the congregation at the time about, do we want to become a parish and become just like everybody else? You know, that there was something about moving to stability and being able to call a full-time rector that in some ways made people feel like, well, now we're not going to quite be the community that we felt like we were in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And Jenny Olbrecht, certainly when she was here in the mid-90s as interim rector, I think was sort of feeling some of those dynamics as we were discerning the call for our first full-time rector, which ended up being the Reverend Jim Bills, who arrived in 1997. And so that's the end of my talk here, but I'm really excited now to have our panel sort of add their own color to this story and this time. So I'll invite Deacon Greg up, and if our panelists could please take one of the 4 seats here, and I'm going to play Vanna White with the microphone and move around. So thank you.
Well, while they're getting a seat, I want to share this perspective with you. When we looked at the mission statement that was created back when Alan was here, and directly and indirectly, 4 people up here will be part of that. What struck me, that hasn't changed that much. That group formed the identity of this church, which is actually carried back with the 3 Sarahs. this ability of a church to focus on reaching out, serving justice, helping people in need. Of course, the health of a church is always can be seen in terms of people sharing in that identity. And so, for people here, we're a big part of forming who we are today and caring for what happened 100 years ago. So, each of you have been involved directly and indirectly, intimately, and with so much over 35 years. We want to spend some time hearing each of your perspectives in terms of looking back, in terms of what you saw through your eyes, because Tom's going to look at it differently than Herbert, and Thelma's going to look at it differently than Esther, because we're all different people. And so we want to bring that blend in of what you saw, of what you felt. So I guess the thing that I always wondered about was knowing that St. Stephen's was going through a tough time, as Adam mentioned, the doors might have been closed. It was a time of uncertainty. Why did you choose to either continue to worship at St. Stephen's or come to St. Stephen's? So why don't we start with Tom and we'll go down if that's okay.
Well, look, is everybody having order breakfast? Look, this is a long story and a short story all at the same time. Adam moved to Charleston with his wife Billy from New York, went to Berkeley, and the rest. And I got to do it pretty quick. I remember the first time I laid eyes on him. And it was in front of Grace Church right before the 8 o'clock Eucharist on Sunday morning. But after that, and I'm going to shorten this, but we can have questions later if we have time. Alan called me when they came to see me and said, look, it was right after that meeting, with Charles was, maybe you left, at the restaurant. And he said, look, I want to be priest in charge at St. Stephen's. Would you go see the bishop and ask him to appoint me to that position? I was chancellor of the diocese at the time. So I went to see the bishop. He was a little worried about the whole thing. And but finally, he agreed. And he says, I will appoint Alan to be priest in charge of St. Stephen's on one condition. And that is that it doesn't turn into be a white church. That we need an integrated congregation. And we got too many white churches already at downtown. So Alan, we said we agreed. We had a meeting that this caused a little bit of unrest, believe it or not, in the neighborhood. That we were doing something strange here at St. Stephen's. And we had a meeting at a neighborhood house, neighbor's house, right across the street. The bishop came, Fitzsimmons Allison. Mm-hmm. And we all were there and had a big crowd. Charles was there, and you might have been there. And we said, look, we're not going to change the world. We just want to have an Episcopal congregation worship there. And the bishop said some good things, and it calmed them down, and we were allowed to go forward. But that was an interesting time. Now, I just want to say a few words about Alan, and I'm not going to talk long. By the way, Adam, you call me down if I get off into a place that I ought not to be, okay? In terms of length as well. I worry about that. I am a lawyer, and I'm used to talking. So anyway, Alan Houghton, as Adam said, came from this luxurious background in New York. And I want to say just a little bit about that because it looks like he wouldn't have fit here, but he did perfectly. His father, Emory Houghton, had this glass company, Corning Glass Works, that the family basically owned. They do sell stock. in the company, but they own substantially the company right now. So Alan came down here, and he was entirely different from anything that anybody expected. But I met him early on, as I said, and of the 5 fingers on my hand, he was one of my 5 best friends in life. And I was with Alan and Billy when they were on the edge of dying at close to the same time up in Paul's Island. That's the closeness of our relationship. But anyway, Alan was perfect for this job here. He was wonderful, and one of the greatest blessings of my life is getting to know him. Now, Alan had a sense of humor, and one day he called me, and by the way, on the homeless shelter that Adam mentioned, he contributed a large amount of money out of his back pocket to do that. His father, by the way, Amory Houghton Sr., was ambassador of the United States in France and the United Kingdom. So it was a substantial background. Now, Alan called me one day, and this was well into everything here, and said, Tom, would you go with me, this was like on a Monday or Tuesday, would you go with me to spend the night at the homeless shelter Thursday night? And, you know, Alan's one of those people in my life, and there are not many of them, but there are a few that I can count, that you say yes and then ask them what it's about. So I said, Alan, why are we going to the homeless shelter on Thursday night to spend the night? And he said, well, it's because Billy, his wife, B-I-L-L-I-E, Billy, he said, I have just acquired a brand new box of Havana cigars, and Billy won't let me smoke them in the house. So I never thought I'd be doing that. But we went up there to the homeless shelter, spent the whole night, helped with breakfast next morning, and smoked the cigars during the night in the dark. So that's the kind of person you had in Alanson Bigelow Houghton. And to lose him, he and Billy decided to move to Georgetown. And after living there for a year or two, they moved up. Their final resting place is at Paul's Island. And he and Billy are both buried under a tree at Holy Cross Faith Memorial Church up there.
Okay. What was the question?
You were at St. Stephen's. Why did you stay in such an uncertain time?
Okay, the reason I stayed at St. Stephen's is because I love St. Stephen's. St. Stephen's is my home. And I love the people at St. Stephen's. We were really a family. You could depend on each other. If anything happened to one, the congregation rallied around them. And I just couldn't see myself being anyplace else but at St. Stephen's.
Tom Tisdale covered the story of Alan Houghton, but Jim and I got to know Alan when he moved down here and decided that he was bored and decided that he would go to the bishop, and that was what started the whole thing with Thomas. He actually got bored. And my husband, at the same time, he retired in his 50s, and he got bored. And so my husband went on to build the aquarium, and Alan got permission from the bishop to come to St. Stephen's, but on one condition, and Alan told my husband and me, the bishop was giving me 2 years in order to integrate St. Stephen's. If you can't do it in 2 years, the bishop will close St. Stephen's. And so my husband and I, with the Tisdale, one of the first white couples to integrate St. Stephen's. And George Shine, standing at the front door, literally hugged me when I walked in the door as a moment that I'll never forget as long as I live. And because of his love, Jim and I we told Alan that yes, we will stay here for 2 years and give him that opportunity to integrate St. Stephen's. And as we started, as Tom will tell you, it grew instantaneously. All of a sudden, within 6 months, a year, we had a huge congregation, and the African Americans were staying. We did lose about 20% of our church in the beginning, which was very sad for all of us. But for those who stayed, we started to grow and become a magical family. And one, I just would like to talk a little bit about John Richards. I got to know him personally, and Irving. For those who knew Irving, she's like somebody out of heaven. She'd walk down the aisle and tell you what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and what the church should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. And she was very open about that, and John let her do that. And one of the things about John is that he was a great preacher, but every single time that he spoke and preached, every time, he started with a joke. And the jokes were the funny, and he said it with a completely straight face. And the church fell out laughing. And he had a different joke every single time he preached. No one could understand where he got, and they were fabulous jokes. So that's a story of love. And John Richards and Irving got to be close personal friends of ours. And they would come out to Secessionville and have lunch and dinner with us. And my husband had a great orchid collection. And we were having lunch one day. And John said that he had not seen the orchid collection, so Jim asked me to take John out to the orchid collection. So we were walking through the garden, and John stopped me, put his arms around me, and said, I want to tell you something. Many years ago, I taught Latin at Portugal. I knew then that he was a prodigy, that we literally were working with someone who was gifted by God with an intellect that none of us could touch. He was so incredibly impressive to be with. So St. Stephen's changed gems in my life. We not only fell in love with it and the Tisdalls, we were in it together. You were not just by yourself. You had the Fergusons with you on that. We were sitting in that church together. And so I must tell you that St. Stephen's changed my life. And for that, I'm very thankful to be here. Thank you very much.
I don't think I need the mic, do I? No.
We're streaming it.
Oh, okay. All right. I came back towards the tail end. That 2-year that Esther mentioned obviously was successful. I got back out of the Air Force in 1991 and came back home. And I do recall, as I may have shared with many of you during times when I've had to have a conversation with the congregation, that my dad called me and said, we have white people that are attending the church now. I think this was probably 1990s, or probably 1988, because we were in Portugal. We got to Portugal in early 1988. And he called and told me that white people were attending the church. And quite frankly, I didn't have a problem with it because my time in the Marine Corps and in the Air Force, there was integration. So there wasn't nothing new. I will say that when I got back, one of the things that I enjoyed about St. Stephen's, obviously my mom and dad, they were here, and also my children, they became members of St. Stephen's. My son was baptized here. I think my daughter was baptized here as well. So those things made it real to me, a little bit more real, because when we were overseas, one of the scariest memories I had overseas was trying to get into a church in the Azores. And I remember at the time my wife was pregnant, and Baptist priest and my senior leader came over to the house to try to convince her to come to church. And I'm sitting there, and it was really awkward for me because you had this man of the cloth and this guy that I work for browbeating my pregnant wife, telling her if she doesn't come to church, our daughter was going to burn in hell. Literally, that kind of conversation. And I believe what I learned in St. Stephen's gave me the courage
This is being live streamed, so I can't curse, right? We can't bleep things out? I told them to get the heck out of my house, but I used a stronger four-letter word. And I thought that that would compromise my standing in my unit at the time, and it didn't. And Staff Sergeant Woody Goodyear, he apologized to me the next morning for browbeating my wife. But I got to tell you, if I hadn't understood what it meant to be a Christian, based on the things I learned here, I don't think I would have had the courage to challenge them the way that I did.
So, now, let's reflect back at the time in the 1990, late 80s. Integrating a church was a big deal in downtown Charleston. Now, it's easy for us today to sit back and look at this through eyes of admiration, time of feeling like that was a really neat thing to happen. But I'm wondering if we can share some thoughts of what you had to go through to do that, because that was a time of huge transition in this community. So any memories from that, of the difficulties, the challenges?
Well, we had to meet with the neighborhood group. We had to meet with the neighborhood group across the street to convince them that we weren't going to rebel and try to overthrow the government. I mean, that's what it boiled down to. And that calmed down. Then we had to persuade the bishop to appoint Alan as the priest in charge. And we went through that, and it calmed down. And this is where we are. This is where you are.
Yep.
Now, one thing about Alan, I'll tell you one other thing quickly. He came up to me right after the bishop appointed him priest and said, look, now that we've gotten me appointed priest in charge, he said, appointed priest in charge, I want you to help me organize the church. And of course, I couldn't say no, but I expected to come around here and spend about 2 weeks, and that would be that. And Alan and I would go down the road and just have a drink occasionally. But that organization for me was 15 years.
At one time, we thought that we were going to be run out of the neighborhood because the word got out that we were trying to have a homeless shelter in the church. So we had to, what we did, we started inviting the neighborhood in to have meetings that used the church as a neighborhood meeting association. And they actually got to see what we were doing, because otherwise they thought we would have people sleeping in the pews. And then with Alan getting the homeless shelter organized, I think that helped us too.
I was on the vestry when Jenny Olbrich was here as an interim priest, and we got the word that we could get we could buy the house that the priest lives in. What do you call it? The rectory. And during that time, the vestry not only was against it, but we were told that if we took the church, if the church took the mortgage, that we would have to pay the mortgage. And the vestry was very anti that, and because we didn't really have the money then. And Jenny and I and a few of the vestry members started praying that God would help us work through this. It was such a desperate time in the church. And the church did not want that. Alan Houghton was not interested in children. He didn't want to have children here, and was very adamant about that. He wanted everybody to have white hair, and I'm not making this up, it's true. Alan he just really wanted only white-haired people in the church. And this little tiny square box back here was enough for him. So Jenny Ulbrich and I and a few of the vestry members got together, and we decided to take the mortgage, and that we would pay the mortgage down. And my husband and I got involved in that, and a few of the vestry members got involved, and we were able to sustain the mortgage for a year to keep that property. And I am sure that God had his hand in that. Can you imagine that if we didn't have that property today, what St. Stephen's would look like? My goodness, we would not be a church today if we didn't have it. So that was a big moment in my life that I was a part of that mortgage, and I'm very proud to tell you that I was a part of that.
Herbert.
I think during that time there was there are two things that stood out for me. One is that as the blacks began to leave St. Stephen's, there was this rotating group of blacks who served on the vestry. Yeah. So it just went around, and it kept going around. So you'd serve a couple of years, or 2 or 3 years, and then your name would come up again. And then the other thing that I recall, and this is part of my vestry experience, whenever there was an issue that could compromise the black culture or history of the church, we always had, there was I think, a small caucus of black women in the church. I remember Edna, some of them in Miss Washington, young Drayton, we need to have a conversation about this. So they would always find me and talk to me about controversial issues to make sure that I heard their voice and I voted in a manner that they approved of.
Yeah. Now, Herbert, do you feel that the white people knew what was at stake for the black people in the church at that time? In other words, the black people had a lot more on the line than the white people who just came into the church. This was your church.
Greg, I think the thing that I know, I asked myself during this transition, because I paid attention to the types of people that were coming into the church. Mm-hmm. They were lawyers, doctors, business folks, accountants, professionals. And the question I often ask myself is, if we had that level of professionals in St. Stephen's, would we have reached that tipping point in 1987? And also, there's sort of this corporate overlay of the church. We had enough hymnals and prayer books for everybody who attended the church. And then we had the bulletins that came in, so that added a layer of had a corporate feel to me. And then instead of just asking to give, the signaling was give as you are able to. So the language was adjusted to draw people in. And you also got to keep in mind, a capital campaign for the church back then was a barbecue. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Not writing a check or saying that we're going to raise $1 million, or I think the house was $300,000. Those were scary numbers for people in the church. And I do believe, Greg, that we had some of the flight in the black community because there wasn't a level of intentionality that communicated to them how they would be involved in the church when this grand experiment really took flight. And it was moving at such a velocity that the communication was just on building up the church, getting the people in, and not necessarily paying attention to the folks who were leaving the church.
I must say, during that time of the vestry and the rectory and the mortgage, when we finally got the mortgage, I just want to tell you this: we were hated by the church. This was not something that they wanted. It was the antithesis of what Alan liked, and we all love Alan, but it's absolutely true that he did not want children here. So it was a time in my personal life where I actually got hate from the church, and my husband did, because we were so programmed to believe that God gave us that building so that priests would have a place to live and serve this church. So this was a very desperate time in our history. that I still live through the pain of the hate that my husband and I got. And I will tell you this, Jenny Ulbrich was a star. She really is unbelievable in her Christianity. Everybody comes to church next Sunday because she is really somebody who had a big role in that mortgage and in getting that rectory for us, and being a big role in helping St. Stephen's grow. Much love.
Briefly, Alan. One of the things that stands out in my mind about this early reorganization was there was a woman in the congregation, a white woman named Allison Hallwood. There's a monument back here right behind this building in her memory. She died as a communicant of this parish. But she came down here from the north, with all respect, and so she had a mind as to what things were going to be done like around here. And she came in and walked into my office one day and said, "Tom, we got a problem that I know you'll know how to handle." I said, "What is it, Allison?" She said, this was right after Alan Houghton had retired from hell, and the next priest was present. But Alan came to church. She said, "Did you notice last Sunday that Alan came here not wearing a clerical collar or a tie?" And I had noticed that, but I wasn't going to say that I did. And I said, "Allison, did that really happen?" She said, "It did." And she said, "The reason I've come to see you is I want you to go see Alan, and I want you to see that that does not happen again." And I said, "Allison, let me tell you something. There are a lot of things in this life that I'll do, but that ain't one of them."
So I'm wondering about, we just got a few more minutes here, about the feel of the church on two levels, and just maybe reflect back. The feel of today, St. Stephen's is a very welcoming place, warm, people reach out to each other, and kind of reflect back to what you were saying, Thelma, of what it was like in the beginnings, what the church, the identity of the church had been. I think we've continued that. But I'm wondering, do you feel it's different today than then? And also, do you think the worshiping experience is different? What has changed, if anything, in terms of your memories going back?
I do think that there is a change. Back when I first started coming to St. Stephen's, the music was different.
Mm-hmm.
And then we used, along with the regular hymnal, we used Lift Every Voice, which was in addition to the songs that we normally sang. And instead of, well, now the hymnals goes along with the lessons, but back then, if we liked the song, we just sang it.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoyed that. And now the worship is more structured. Because back then, well, most times we didn't have a priest. So we came in, we did morning prayer and sang, and we left. But now it's more structured. I enjoy the hymns, but I would like to have a little more spirituals.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That's a message for the rector.
Well, let's end on this final question. Think back of what your fondest memory was during this time of integration. Can you think of something that just happened during that time that you'd like to share with us?
My fondest memories are bringing my children to church every other Sunday. My wife and I were divorced, and they were with me every other weekend, and my fondest memories were bringing them here. And I think I carried my son in my arms until he was 5 or 6 years old. So that's just what he wanted to do. And then Red Thurman actually painted a picture of us standing in front of this window. She took a snapshot. And I think the painting sold for like $4,000. So I didn't buy it.
Tom, do you think we could talk any more about Alan Houghton? Because I think I put us, I think when I talked about the fact that he didn't like children, that kind of opened up, and you were absolutely. We could talk about Alan, and so it's one of the things about being in an integrated church is that one of the things about St. Stephen's, and this is why we're here and why my husband and I are here, we believe truly that all people are children of God. And I believe that that's what makes us different from all the other white churches in Charleston, is that we really do believe that.
What I have to say really is in my fondest memory, but it goes back to when we didn't have a minister and we did not have an organist. So a lady that came to St. Stephen's, she wasn't really a member because her father was a Baptist minister and she could not leave his church to join St. Stephen's, but she was here 3 Sundays out of the month, and she went to her father one Sunday. But we didn't have an organist, and she said, I'll be happy to play. So she played the organ for us, but she couldn't play and sing at the same time. When she sang, she was off on the organ, and the whole congregation got confused.
Well, I mean, you know, all you have to do is look around and look and see what you see. And the fondest memory is that this place became, due to the leadership that the church had, this place became a house of God for all people. No exception. And that is what I think is my fondest memory, which covers half a century.
So we had the same experience, Tom.
We did. We did indeed.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to our rector.
I don't want to keep us too long, and we can continue this outside with the reception, but I just wonder if there are 1 or 2 questions or comments or wonderings. Yes, Barbara.
I'm wondering what kind of advice you can give us to encourage more people of color to join St. Stephen's.
Just ask them, and I had this, I had lunch with a colleague earlier in the week, black hedge fund manager, lives right around the corner on Society Street, and we were talking business, and I knew that he'd been here like 7 years, and I said, well, where do you go to church? And he said he's looking for it. And I said, well, I got one for you. And Jerry Rice, he texted me this morning. I told him I attended the 7:45 service, and he texted me at 7 o'clock this morning. And he said, ask me, is there a Trinity church somewhere?
Trinity is the Methodist Church?
Well, he asked me the name of the church. I said, no, St. Stephen's, 7:45, 9, 11 a.m. And he said, I'm on the way. I walked in, and he was sitting. I think just inviting people to come to the service to make sure that they know that there are 3 services, I think that would be helpful for them as well. And quite frankly, if you're going to invite an African American to the church, and you know they've got my number, I'll be happy to show up
Yes, Vicki?
Herbert, you were saying something about controversies, and you said that a couple of times. So what we consider a controversy, maybe what you guys considered at that time a controversy.
You said you guys last.
No. You said the church was going through controversies.
Okay.
So the congregation back in the 80s, what controversies were the sticking points that caused so much?
I think everyone in the congregation has their own definition of acceptable change, right? And, all the glasses were stained glasses at one point in time. When we decided to do that, that was a controversy. I think most of you were probably here when we did the ramp. That was a controversy. And then one time we had this stainless steel ramp that we placed at the door. Horrible. OSHA would have a field day with that. Right? They found that was out there, right? And then when we decided, when we were talking about buying a house, that was a controversy. When we used to have Sunday school up here in law, when all those things changed, it was that type of controversy. But I think that all of those things are going to accompany growth. I remember when we had a conversation about moving from a parish to a mission to a parish, I had to look at what that meant. And one of the definitions I found is that typically the mission goes from a parish to a 50 families, right? We're about 50 families. Well, 50 families or more. Well, we were like growing like weeds. You couldn't stop the people from coming in. So any type of change, folks push back on it. We're going to have the same conversations around some of what we're going to do with the capital campaign. But this church is resilient, and we just lean into these kinds of things and keep moving forward.
So they weren't social justice controversies. They were controversies about the church itself.
We probably had some noise around, and I know the sisters were listening to this book. When we started embracing the LGBTQ community, I think there was some soft controversy around that. And we talked about, I mentioned the clergy community. I remember my dad telling me that David, who was here, my dad said, I don't like David's preaching because I don't understand what he says. He had this very academic presentation about his sermons. So, and I think some of that has to do with the loss and trying to hold the blacks back in with gentrification and then push them out. And then trying to see that's just not
Yes.
Do the African Americans in the church feel like they can bring in their families and their friends and help build it back and help become a part of their lives as well?
definitely.
Yeah.
Whenever my daughter's in town, she'll be happy to attend the church here.
Right.
And quite frankly, I probably have more white friends than black friends. I don't know why the white ones
Last question in the back.
Good evening and good afternoon to all of you. This is my first time here, and I'm a native Charlestonian. I'm a Bishop Bailey graduate, and my mother also had the first licensed African American daycare here in Charleston. So I just feel that I just want to share something. When your question is how can we bring more people, particularly integrating, I've been Catholic, I've been A&E, I even believe this one when I took a class with Mr. J. W. Marion himself for the Mormon Church when I lived in Washington, D.C. So I'm very open, and what I'm open to is the fellowship. It's not so much the denomination, but when I embrace or I go to visit, it's where I feel welcome. I feel like family. And so the suggestion to you all is expand your horizon of people that you know. And then once you do that, have a family and friends, invitational type Sunday service, where you make people who come in feel welcome to the point that they want to stay. And I'll leave this with you. One of the last churches that I did join was an AME church. And I actually went to a funeral. And after the funeral, there was a recast. And I tell you, it was the best sweet tea I had.
we give all of our candidates a big round of applause for taking their time? Please don't forget, we have one more educational event, October 16th at 5 p.m. here in the church on our LGBT history and legacy. But please do join us for some refreshments out on the lawn. It looks like the weather has held up for us. Thank you so much for coming.